Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 45 to 50 minutes. On March the 21st, 1960, one of the most horrific days had occurred in apartheid South Africa. Black Africans had protested in the town of Sharpville, requesting for one thing and one thing only. Why do we need to be treated as aliens in our own homeland? Of course, this came into effect when the past laws was approved by the then National Party government under the Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd. It was, of course, also known as the Dompas, and the citizens of South Africa, mainly the black African citizens, took it upon themselves to show resistance against it and burn their Dompas. What followed after was a bloodbath of epic proportion. And when I mean epic proportion, it was something that was of a horror story. 69 people had lost their lives and over 180 people had been injured. It changed the face of South Africa altogether and took resistance against apartheid to a whole new level. Well, on Truth to Power today, this will be our discussion 61 years on and remembering those of the Sharpville Massacre. My guest today with me is Dr. Brown Maba. He is a historian, Professor Frans Viljoen from the Director of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. But first up, we have with us a survivor of the Sharpville Massacre, Mrs. Elizabeth Chabini. Mrs. Chabini, thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
Okay, thank you.
No, it is an absolute pleasure. Mrs. Chabini, take us through what happened on that day. Take us through how everything had unfolded. Take us through your eyewitness experience of what had happened on the day of March the 21st, 1960.
On the 21st of March, early in the morning, the people were not going to work because of this Dompas. The people, they said, we are tired of this Dompas because we're living in the
apartheid South Africa, yes.
Now we are going to the old police station, and there were a lot of people there. We were singing Tanzania. We asked them to take these dumpers. We don't want it anymore. There were a lot of aeroplanes. They were flying low and violently. After that, they come to us, they say, go home and have a lunch. After 2 o'clock, you must come back to get the answer. The people, they say, no, we can't go there. We want the answer now. And you are still singing, Senzemina, Senzemina. After hours, we heard the gunshot. The people running away. The other one falling down. The other one goes side by side. And when we were running, I heard something beat my hand. There was a man, he came to me and hold my hand, ran with me. I was shot here.
Okay. Well,
after that, when we are running, I met the neighbor of my home. He saw it's me. He ran to get his car and take me to the hospital, Vredendal Hospital. I stayed there at Vredendal Hospital a month. And I come back home. The other people go to different hospitals. And the other one, he was dead.
Mrs. Chabini, I just listening to your story, just sort of, yeah, it sends shivers down my spine. I'm nearly in tears, but I have to compose myself, obviously, because this is a broadcast. Were any of your friends, were any of your family members injured or hurt during this massacre? Did you know anyone personally who had lost their lives during this horrific day in South Africa?
No, I just my neighbors. At my home, it was only me injured. Yes.
Mrs. Chabini, obviously, after everything that had happened and we saw the Rivonia trial that occurred and so many of the ANC leaders were sentenced to prison, did you feel that on this day, even though democracy only came 34 years after, did you one day believe, as somebody who had survived this, that the apartheid regime would be defeated?
No.
And Mrs. Chabini, you know, we're playing images now of it here live on TV, just showing the people of how bad the massacre was. Why wasn't there any sort of control from the police? Did you feel that the police came there for one reason and one reason only, and that was to kill the people of Sharpville?
Yes.
Mrs. Chabini, I also want to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because obviously this was established just after South Africa went into democracy. Were you one of those that testified at the TRC, and were you one of those who felt that justice was served? Because so many elderly people that I speak to, friends of my friends of the elderly within my family, always felt that justice was not served. Do you believe justice was served, seeing it front on what had happened at the Sharpville massacre?
No, they didn't serve. Until today.
Mrs. Chabini, please continue, Mrs. Chabini.
They fail us, and they don't give us nothing. Me, I didn't go to TRC because the TRC closed early. I didn't get nothing. They know us on the 21st of March. After that, they gone. The government do nothing for us. Nothing. I live with grants.
Mrs. Chabini, if the ANC or if anyone in government is watching the show or watching this program, what is your message to them? I've seen that you've lost a finger during this horrific day. What would be your message to them? Because you are one of the 180 that were injured in this. What is your message to government to at least help you during these difficult times? Because you're not just a person who lived during apartheid. You are somebody who had on experienced what had happened on this horrific day. So what is your message to the government of South Africa and to the ruling party of the country?
My message is this: they must bring TRC. They must give us reparations because we are suffering. Our blood cells, we are injured. We live with wounds. So I ask government to help us because they don't help us. They just talk and talk on the 21st of March, and after that, they don't come back to us. They promised us to make this, and they didn't make it.
Mrs. Chabini, please do continue.
Government, they know us. They must come back to us. Bring back TRC to talk to them about us.
Mrs. Chabini, we thank you so much for making the time for us. We are going to leave you now, and just the time that you have spent with us has really given us a full-on idea of what had happened at Sharpville Massacre. You hear Mrs. Chabini, she's saying that 21st of March is a public holiday, but it's never really looked at of what had happened to those who had suffered injuries, who had suffered so much on that day in 1960. Mr. Chabini, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you all the best, and we hope that you will get the support and everything that is needed for you to overcome something that was supposed to be given to you immediately after democracy. And 61 years, there's been no sense of, reprieve for those who suffered at Sharpville Massacre. I really feel this is an absolute tragedy. Mr. Chabini, we thank you so much. Mrs. Chabini? I think we've lost Mrs. Chabini there. Well, she's just given us a first-hand account of what had happened at the Sharpville Massacre, which occurred 61 years ago on March the 21st. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. My conversation will then move to Professor Frans Viljoen and Dr. Brown Maba. Welcome back to Truth to Power. Let us shift the conversation to Dr. Brown Maba. He's a historian, and Professor Frans Viljoen, the director of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Maba, you just heard what Mrs. Chabini had said. When you look at what had happened, this was something that you could have taken from a horror book, and it would have fitted perfectly of what had happened in Sharpville on March the 21st, 1961.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the shooting wasn't exactly expected at that particular day, because in the 1950s, if you look at the activities of the ANC, it was based on march protests and so on, and friction here and there between the apartheid state and the ANC, as well as the SACP at the time, and the birth of the PAC in 1960. But at that particular time, the apartheid regime decided to change its strategy and to enforce what they regarded as the rule of law, which was basically abuse of rights, of human rights. And when it happened in 1960, in that march, which was organized by the PAC, South Africa changed completely. We had moved from the era of protest and marches and so on into killings, and it resulted in the birth of Umkhonto for the ANC, because Umkhonto was born out of that 1960 shootings, as well as Upoko, which was the military wing for the PC, was born at that particular time. So we entered the era of the armed struggle, and South Africa would never be the same again.
Professor Viljoen, you've obviously seen, during obviously the first part of the show, Mrs. Chabini, who lost her finger during that horrific day. We've seen, human rights atrocities occurring way before, obviously, Sharpville Massacre. One as near as, of course, the Holocaust that happened with the extermination of Jews by the Nazis. But this was something that took a whole different turn, didn't it, with regards to what had happened on that day?
Yes, no, for us, that is certainly so. I think, with you, I think it is, in a sense, painful, but also wonderful to have heard the voice of Mrs. Chabini, to just humanize something that, increasingly the younger generation, people in this century read history books, but they may lack that human touch. And I think what she brought is just this painful reminder of what it really meant to people. And, remembering that the 69 people were killed, but certainly, you mentioned the close to 200 people that were also injured and the untold suffering. So I think, we saw that a regression into violence. And as Professor Mabe said, it's a moment where perhaps, the whole struggle changes. And that, in a sense, is also a precursor to what we see in Soweto, on 16 June in Soweto. Again, this loss of control, this authoritarianism that, in a sense, spills over into lawlessness, but in the name of the rule of law. But as you said, a perverted sense of what the rule of law would entail.
Dr. Maba, of course, when we talk about Sharpville, we did see the Native Land Act obviously take its whole different way. Of course, the Native Land Act had been established many years after that, but the moving into shanty towns had changed so much. Sharpville was seen as that movement into a shanty town, and the apartheid government right there and then had begun its crackdown with regards to the beginning of that Dompas.
Yeah, I'm afraid seriously so, because, in order for the state to control the movement of blacks and to further oppress them and so on, the issue of Dompas was emphasized and ensured that it was carried out. I remember, for instance, in the 1980s, that my uncle in Springs, I grew up in Springs, in Guatemala, was always chased around by the police, local police called Amapezenia. They were linked to the municipal offices at that time. Always harassed, always looking for the Dompas. My grandmother had to lock him in, several times and tell the police he's not here, when we know very well that he was hidden in a bedroom, The issue of Dompas, was actually made to control people who were forcefully removed from areas what do you call this place in Johannesburg?
From the cities.
Removed from such areas, black spots, into Soweto and other areas, from Charterstein in Niger into Dudus and other areas. People who were removed from Brakpan into Guatemala and other areas. The only way to control them was to enforce the issue of the Dompas. And, it brought serious tension, as we all know, between the state and the people, resulting into people not carrying these Dompas and then resulting into arrest and so on, and exile and all those things, And I'm afraid, police brutality grew from time to time until the 1980s. And when the Dompas was more or less dropped around 1989, 1988, it was one of the important things that people fought against, the change in South Africa and so on, leading to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990. So this was a symbol of hatred and a symbol of oppression, which if you go to Apartheid Museum today, you will find copies of Dompas and so on, and the nature of the Dompas and so on, and their limiting effects and the psychological effects that they had on the minds of many Africans.
Yeah, you mentioned you were born in Springs. I grew up in Benoni, so we have one thing in common there, Dr. Maba. And you speak about, obviously, the now Ekurhuleni metropolitan. A lot of the people that were staying in the Benoni areas had to be shifted to an area called Actonville, where a lot of the Indian Muslims and the rest of the Indians had to stay in. So that's something that my grandparents can relate to, because they were obviously one of those who felt the effects of the apartheid government. Professor Viljoen, as what Dr. Maba is saying, the forcible removement of people into the shanty towns, that already signified a huge change of how the apartheid government would abuse human rights, especially that of the majority within South Africa.
Yes, certainly. And I think we see this in many dimensions, but I think it also reveals the very paradox on which the apartheid state was based. It was endeavoring to create a white space, a white-only space, but at the same time, the apartheid state was clearly made itself dependent on what it considered to be cheap labor. So it was that paradoxical, kind of economic endeavor, but the dependence on others that somehow did not fit in this model. So it was always going to be coming to a kind of a turning point or a boiling point. It was untenable, clearly, to both subscribe to this notion of what the apartheid South Africa should look like and depend on labor. So the repressive measures were just logically flowing from this paradox, from this untenable situation in which the state almost by mere logic found itself.
Dr. Maba, 1960, the pass law comes into effect. This is, of course, it went past the 2/3 majority that was approved by the National Party. This was something that Hendrik Verwoerd had pushed for, hadn't he? This was something that when he came into power, when he had won the elections, the one thing he truly wanted was for this pass law to come into effect. And for him, seen from a National Party point of view, this was a success, but it wasn't a success for the majority of South Africa, because this would really take apartheid to a whole new level.
Yeah, for the people, they realized that, this oppression was getting stiffer and stiffer. For the state, for Verwoerd and others, this was success because this is what they wanted, to oppress and ensure that repression continues unhindered, and to ensure that the people are properly oppressed and clearly oppressed, and that, you put a vice grip around their necks and they are unable to move. But it actually made people to be more and more determined to overthrow the apartheid state. Because come 1976, there was an uprising. Come the 80s, the birth of the UTF in 1983, and the uprisings in townships and so on. The people ensured that, apartheid and its repressive laws, including passes, was dealt with or done away with. And people responded strongly to what Oliver Tambo said in exile, when he said that you must declare the townships ungovernable and make apartheid unworkable. It was stones against guns, rubber bullets against guns, stones against bullets, until 1990. And an important element here also, of course, was the involvement of Inkatha in the killings in the 1980s. So it was becoming more and more brutal day by day. I think when the apartheid state decided to undo apartheid in 1990, they now had nowhere to hide. The international community was on their case. The people on the ground were fighting against them strongly. MK activities were being intensified inside the country. And, the country was becoming poor and bankrupt. And civil war was at the doorsteps of the country. So that's why de Klerk decided, it ends here, because from here going forward, we won't be able to move as a country. It's just going to be civil war. South Africa, if a decision was not made at that particular time to do away with apartheid, South Africa would be a wasteland today. It would have been a serious watershed, a serious civil war, and a country that has lawlessness and disorder.
After the break, we'll be continuing the conversation with Dr. Brown Maba and Professor Frans Viljoen as we commemorate the Sharpville Massacre 61 years on. Welcome back to Truth to Power. We are continuing our conversation, remembering the Sharpville Massacre 61 years on. Professor Viljoen, I want to come to you. In the late Sir Richard Attenborough biopic, Cry Freedom, in that opening scene in a township in Cape Town where the apartheid police bulldozers go through the entire settlement, you could see right there and there human rights was being trampled on in every opportunity that was being given by the apartheid government. When you look at that, you take the past laws, you take a look at how then Prime Minister Verwoerd wanted to execute all of this. Just how bad was human rights being trampled upon in those dark days of apartheid?
Yeah, I think it's almost difficult for us to imagine. Today we certainly have a very different dispensation. I'm sure we'll speak about that. The point about those years is that we didn't have a justiciable Bill of Rights. There was no recourse. So whatever the executive did, whatever the legislature decided to legislate, those were beyond anyone's redress. There was no constitutional avenue to explore. And clearly, if there isn't even the possibility of accountability or a test against the Constitution, then your executive, your official on the ground is left really in terms of very small incentives, little incentive to observe and respect the rights of those individuals. Now, clearly, today we note human rights violations, and clearly we should. And we bring this to the attention, and we have a vibrant press and constitutional court and courts. But if we think back to the scenario you sketch, then it is really incomparable. It is incomparable in terms of the extent, in terms of the pervasiveness of those violations, but also the lack of any prospect of accountability for all those violations within that context.
Dr. Maba, let's go back to that date in 1960. For the younger generation, including myself, we've seen images. Of course, we played it on screen, images, and of course the movie The Long Walk to Freedom, where of course, like Mrs. Chabini said, we had aircraft flying down, and we see that obviously dramatized because it's a big Hollywood studio film. But for the people on the ground, it was something far from that, because they knew within a moment of 5 to 10 seconds, their life would have been lost. Dr. Maba, when you see the pictures, when you see what happened, just take us through your take on everything of how bad March the 21st, 1960 truly was.
It was truly a terrible day. And as I said to you, I don't think the shootings were expected on that day. But the apartheid government had changed its strategy. The people were taken by surprise. People were shot, most of them at the back whilst running away, which means, the intention was to shoot to kill. No, not doubt about it. And if we move the scene from Sharpville, for instance, and take it to Cape Town in Langa, where the march took place as well, 2 people were killed as well. So clearly, these were the changing times for South Africa, and the area of serious repression and ensuring that the rule of law, which was not actually the rule of law, the rule of misdirected law was enforced. And, it changed the lives of the people of Sharpville. It changed the lives of the people of Langa, who lost their loved ones, who lost their own lives. And to this day, those who are survivors, like Mrs. Chabini, remain with mental and physical scars, I'm afraid. And, and the sad thing about it is that there wasn't counseling to those people at that particular time who had lost their loved ones, who have lost their limbs, who were present there, even if they're not injured, but very shaken. The apartheid state didn't care about all that. They just woke up the next day and moved on with their strategy of repression. Ensuring that political parties are banned. The ANC was banned. The PC was banned after the Sharpville killings. The PC was only 1 year old because it was born in 1959. So come 1960, after Sharpville, it was banned. Then there's exiles, moving into exile. That on its own, the people moving into exile affected people's lives. To live outside South Africa for a period of 30 years, from maybe 1960 to 1990, is also psychologically damaging. You suddenly find yourself in Tanzania, in a camp, unable to go back home, and so on and so on. And you come back after 1990, the country has changed. You are now an outsider in your own country. So the effects of the shootings had its own lasting consequences, which were mentally damaging.
Professor Viljoen, I mentioned obviously the movie The Long Walk to Freedom, and we see the aftermath of it, where again, no accountability from the South African police service under the apartheid government. It seemed that one of the police opened fire, but surely he had to take order, because you have a gun, you have people who don't have any weapons, nothing at all. All they have is their dompas and their voice to voice those concerns. When you look at that, Professor Viljoen, that was immediately another sign of how human rights was violated on that very day.
No, for sure. So that is the tragedy, and I think even at that time there probably were, and I'm not 100% familiar with the details, but there were probably directives in place, but it was the execution of those directives and the point that there were no consequences for the fatalities. I think that it speaks to humanity, that one cannot act in a way that is disproportionate. Clearly, police that has force, the legitimate authority to force and the use thereof in the state, that force needs to be used in a way that is very circumspect. Clearly, one should avoid the excessive use of force. Lethal force should be avoided at all times, and force should always be used in respect of the principles of necessity and proportionality. Only when the use of force is the last option open, after all other options have been explored, can force be used. Clearly, there was no regard to those principles in the context we referred to, but regrettably, we now see, in the recent case that we have witnessed also, that at least some of the police officials had yet again not employed and applied those principles that I now think are quite clearly accepted, universally in South Africa accepted, but it is not applied even in our democratic South Africa, regrettably, as we have witnessed, maybe on much more isolated and smaller scale recently.
Dr. Maba, we obviously immediately after that, the birth of Mkhonto Wesizwe had taken place, and we saw visuals, obviously, with the BBC and other international media houses, showing pictures of former President Nelson Mandela burning his dompas at that very moment. If we take Mkhonto Wesizwe, we look at it as the grassroots level of what had happened and the fight to the apartheid government. How necessary was it that Mkhonto Wesizwe had to step up and take the fight to the apartheid government?
It was very much necessary. remember the Sharpville killings demonstrated that the apartheid regime was prepared to shoot to kill. It was no longer those marches of the 1950s and the 1940s in which, petitions are submitted and so on and so on. Those marches to union buildings in which, people marched to union buildings and nothing much really happened, no shootings, except for some terror here and there. The information of controversies was important. The ANC began to realize, things have changed. They need to fight back. They need to arm themselves, and they need to take the struggle against apartheid to the apartheid government itself. So the information of MK put pressure on the regime as well, to try to make sure that they are not attacked, they're not infiltrated, keep them on their toes. If you look at the attacks by controversies, the Sasol bombings in 1980 and other attacks in South Africa, you realize that the apartheid government was put under serious pressure to succumb and to submit and to allow the rule of law to take place. Other than that, they would have grabbed their feet to this day, I should guess, in some ways. And of course, the formation of controversies leads to arrests. It leads to long sentences, the likes of Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Kevin Mbeki, and others. It leads to detention without trial, the likes of Sobukwe, the first person to be actually detained without trial in South Africa, under what we call the Sobukwe clause. Where Sobukwe was kept at Robben Island, without any trial. Every year his stay there will be extended. Every year would be extended until he was released later. So it really put pressure. It was a necessary thing to do. And unfortunately, the international countries, were willing to support the ANC. South African countries, Tanzania, Angola hosted ANC camps, Tanzania hosted ANC camps, and later on Uganda, where the ANC activists were trained. The Soviet Union also played an important role. The German Democratic Republic, which was socialist link, also played an important role in training MK activity. MK activities. And the whole thing about Operation Around 1989, in which the plan was to make sure that South Africa becomes more and more ungovernable, and that MK was going to be infiltrated further and further inside the country and arm civilians and so on and so on, was very important. Other than that, the apartheid government wouldn't have done anything, to make sure that South Africa is a free country. Instead, they would have just relaxed and enjoyed themselves. Why should they continue to enjoy privileges? So MK put immense pressure on the government to act.
It was a case of waking up the sleeping giant. Before we go to the break, Professor Viljoen, you heard what Mrs. Chabini had mentioned with regards to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We were all told that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was designed for one aspect and one aspect only, to hold those accountable for the crimes against humanity committed in apartheid. But when you listen to Mrs. Chabini's witness, and obviously she didn't attend the TRC, she has every right, doesn't she, to feel aggrieved at what had happened, especially with her losing one of her fingers in her hand.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, perhaps it was good to some extent at establishing the truth. Whether it played a role in reconciliation is kind of a mixed bag. But what everyone agrees is that in terms of reparations, the TRC had really fallen short. I think there was a sense in which, it was an overwhelming issue. How does one address the very widespread, pervasive poverty and material need in South Africa? And perhaps the TRC should have focused more on those particular cases, like the ones arising from Sharpville that were before it. And it should have targeted at least those directly and immediately affected victims more specifically, so that at least that kind of reparation would have been put in place. I mean, there was some of that, but I think that is certainly agreed, one of the great weaknesses of the TRC. Now we see that even prosecutions that were supposed to take place, many of the prosecutions also did not take place. And in the last years, we've seen some voices looking again at reopening the possibilities of those prosecutions now being taken up and instituted. So I think that, maybe through your campaign, through raising the issue in the media, one can again also raise the possibility of reparations, at least for targeted cases, being taken up in the near future.
Yeah, well, the two cases, of course, Neil Agate and Ahmed Timol, hopefully will be able to be justice that occurs. They will stay tuned. We will be wrapping up after the break our conversation in remembering 61 years on from the Sharpville Massacre. Welcome back to Truth to Power. Let me continue the conversation with the Sharpville Massacre. I have with me, of course, Professor Frans Viljoen and Dr. Brown Maba. Professor Viljoen, I want to go to you first. Modern day South Africa in democracy, we've seen two really important events happen. The Marikana Massacre and just last week, students' protests that had happened and the sad killing of a student, of somebody who was caught in the crossfire, just last week. When you look at that, police brutality still becomes an issue even 27 years after democracy.
Yes, that is undeniably so. And I think that, if we think back of the protest at Sharpville, it was a protest that had a very legitimate cause. And the problem arising after that it didn't lead to any accountability and it spurred all these negative consequences. If we now want to draw something positive, which I would like to do from that history, let us be reminded that our 1996 Constitution was in fact signed and, if you like, inaugurated on 10 December 1996 at the very spot, right, in Sharpville. So President Mandela at the time chose to go there to kind of do this symbolical reckoning with the past and in a sense, draw from that the promises for the future. And that makes it even all the more painful, I suppose, right? So we have this history. On the history, we've built this constitution with the values, human dignity. We have the norms in place that should constrain police power. Despite that, we see what had happened, what had occurred in Marikana and in Braamfontein. And I think it is complex, but clearly there's something lacking. There's something lacking in terms of leadership, mixed messages being sent to police officials. I think there's something that is also problematic in terms of resources, how the force is organized. Is there dedicated public order policing sufficiently in place? And training. Training cannot just be technical, but training must be value infused. I do not think that our police officials, people in law enforcement, get to see themselves not as simply enforcers of the law, but really as agents of our democracy. They are there to facilitate public protest. They are there to ensure that our democracy, functions well and not to act in a way that perceives of those who protest as criminals. So it's complex and it's sad. But I think the promise is now there in our constitution that at least there will be accountability and that there is prospects for improvement that had not been there in the time of Sharpville.
Dr. Maba, I want to turn a very similar question to you. We saw during the lockdown that police and the army had sort of used their power to wield. So it just felt that at that time, you compare that to what had happened at Sharpville, a lot of people are reminded of that, aren't they? So I seem to have lost Dr. Maba there. We're going to try and get him back on. Professor Viljoen, that question to you. Again, the first, obviously, level 5 of the lockdown, we saw a lot of the police and the army wielding their force of power, especially in the, still the underprivileged areas, still the areas where service delivery continues to be a problem. And when you talk to people who had survived by Sharpville massacre, who had seen what had happened in apartheid, they had every reason to sort of compare the two, did they?
Yes, I think it is very unfortunate that, it would always be those with the least power in our society, in all societies, that would also be the ones who are most targeted in terms of violence, kind of mistreatment. We have seen that, in this particular instance, we've seen that in South Africa. So, it is not uncommon also to draw the link between race and the violence that we see still in the police, right? How is it that this is still, in a sense, targeted? It's a matter of class and it's a matter of race. How is it that in our democracy that the violence is meted out in this way? That affects, the black population more perhaps than most, particularly those that live in conditions that you describe. That is certainly not what the Constitution proposes that should happen. And again, we should ask ourselves, how is it and how can this be eradicated? Is it through a reorientation of those who yield that power? Is it through thinking, their roles? Is it through a matter of resources, maybe getting the right people into those services, being more kind of circumspect in the appointment of people in those positions, getting better leadership, and ensuring a culture of de-escalation, a culture of a negotiation, as opposed to a culture that really harks back to where we come from, a culture of confrontation and being on the offensive as law enforcement, rather than being part of the community and try to reach out and find solutions.
Professor, one final question. I know in your work with the director the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, a lot of your work is centered around trying to protect the human rights, especially in the vulnerable groups that we have here in South Africa. 61 years on from what had happened at Sharpville, how far or how close are we in achieving total human rights and equality in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if we look at the issue that you addressed now in terms of the socioeconomic deprivation of our people, right? So the basic necessities of life. Yes, we have taken great strides. The governing party will show us that in terms of housing, in terms of water accessibility, there had been changes. Let us not lose sight of those, right? If we look at the broader picture and we put ourselves in the shoes of those people living in those conditions, though, it is still unacceptable. It is still not in line with the promises of the Constitution. If we look at the number of smaller, let's say, insular groups of people who are also vulnerable, you look at persons with disabilities, we look perhaps at sexual minorities, gays, lesbian, transgender persons, and so on. They had certainly been great advances in terms of cultivating a much more accepting, a much more diverse society. I think we have made great strides. But when it comes to the deep-seated inequalities, I think that is where the painful, unaccomplished, work in progress nature of the Constitution comes most candidly to the fore.
Professor Viljoen, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Professor Frans Viljoen, he is the director of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. We also had Dr. Brown Maba, a historian, and of course we started the show with Mrs. Elizabeth Chabini, a survivor of the Sharpville massacre. You saw her first-hand account of what had happened. And the sad part of all of this is that even through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there has been no repatriation or some sort of compensation for those who had suffered dearly in apartheid. Mrs. Chabini lost her finger, and even now, the government of South Africa still turns a blind eye to them. Well, come the 21st of March, they're all willing to go to Sharpville and going and having these big inauguration ceremonies or whatever ceremonies it is, having the media there to show that they truly care. But how they would truly care is by helping those who have been truly affected by what had happened at Sharpville massacre. That is one way of trying to at least soothe the pain of those who had suffered on March the 21st, 1960. This has been another edition of Truth to Power. Do join me again, same time, same place next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.